What would you do if your own children invited you to host a big Christmas dinner, made you pay for everything, and then simply didn't show up? How do you stay calm when you see a photo of them laughing around someone else's table while your food gets cold for 16 empty chairs? And how can a quiet, boring father use law, money, and reputation to change the story without raising his voice once? Before we dive deeper into this story, I have one small request. Please subscribe, drop a like, comment, and hit that hype button to boost this channel so more people can discover these incredible Reddit stories. My name is Thomas Hale, and last Christmas I learned exactly where I stand in my own family. I am 62, retired from a warehouse supervisor job that took 4 decades of my life and most of my back. These days I live in a small 2-bedroom apartment above a pharmacy with thin walls, old pipes, and a view of a parking lot. I do not have a big yard or a fancy kitchen island or a fireplace with matching stockings like my children show off in their photos. What I have is a slow kettle, an old sofa, and a dining table that seats 4 if no one breathes too hard. I also had something I thought mattered more than all that, the wish to spend Christmas with my children and grandkids. For years, Christmas moved around like a traveling show. When the kids were small, it happened in the house where they grew up. I would stay up late wrapping presents after double shifts, then sleep on the couch so they could jump on my bed at dawn. As they got older and married, the center of gravity shifted. 1 year at Mark and Sophie's big new house, 1 year at Leah and Dylan's rental loft with the exposed brick and the tiny tree that cost more than my whole living room. My place, I was told, was too cramped and not really set up for hosting anymore. I nodded and told them I understood. Of course I did. No one wants to squeeze around an old table when they can spread out under a designer chandelier. This year, though, the idea came from them, not me. Mark called first in our family group chat, saying they wanted to do something really special and unforgettable for Christmas. He said a restaurant would be easier for everyone, less stress, more polished. Sophie added that a lavish buffet would be perfect because everyone could choose what they wanted, and no one would have to worry about cooking. Leah chimed in with heart emojis and wrote that the kids would love a big dessert table. None of them said it directly, but the shape of the plan was clear. They would bring the energy and the Instagram photos. I would bring the card. I agreed anyway because the picture in my head was simple. All of us at one long table, the grandkids running between chairs, laughter rising over bad Christmas music. I did not care if I had to pay for every bite to see that. I suggested Ross and Willow Family Bistro, a place I have known for years. It is not a 5-star restaurant, but it is warm and honest. Evelyn, the owner, grew up in the neighborhood and bought it from the previous owners when they retired. She always treated me kindly, even when I came in alone for a plate of meatloaf on Friday nights. When I went in to ask about Christmas reservations, the decorations were already half up. Strings of lights around the windows, a small artificial tree by the bar, paper snowflakes in the corners. The place looked like what I remembered holidays felt like before everything got polished for photos. Evelyn recognized me right away and asked how I was doing. I told her my kids wanted to do Christmas here this year and that I needed a table for 16. Her eyebrows lifted just a little, impressed. She grabbed a big reservation book from under the counter, flipped through the pages, and found a spot. She asked for names, any allergies, kid counts. I told her about the grandkids, about how Mark and Leah were starting a new tradition, and tried to keep my voice steady when I said it. When she asked about the budget, I cleared my throat and said we could do the full buffet package, plus the dessert table, plus the drink package up to a limit. She suggested a cheaper option, seeing my face, but I shook my head. I said I wanted it to be special. She nodded and wrote the number down, then slid the pen toward me to sign. Back at my apartment, I sat at my small table and made a list. 16 little gift bags for each person, even the adults. Nothing big, just small chocolates, a scratch-off ticket, a handwritten note. For the grandkids, a small toy or puzzle tucked into the bags. I spent a few evenings slowly filling them while an old Christmas movie played on my little TV. My hands are not as steady as they used to be, but I took my time writing each name with my neatest block letters. I could already picture their faces when they walked into the bistro and saw the long table with all the bags lined up. In the group chat, messages trickled in as the day got closer. Sophie sent a list of desserts the kids liked and asked if the buffet could include something a little more upscale than the usual pie. Leah joked about bringing extra friends if there was space because we have a crowd this year. Mark wrote that he wanted the reservation late, 8 in the evening, because they had another stop earlier in the day. I told them I would confirm everything with the bistro. No one asked if I needed help paying. No one offered to split the bill. They wrote about outfits, camera angles, and how great it would be to have a proper Christmas vibe this year. I read all of it and answered with short lines. Sure, I'll handle it. No problem. On Christmas Day, I woke up early out of old habit. The apartment was quiet. No little feet, no excited voices, just the radiator ticking and the city outside doing its slow winter breathing. I made myself coffee, put on the one good shirt I still own, and checked the group chat. No new messages. I told myself they were sleeping late, saving energy for the evening. I wrapped my scarf around my neck, picked up the large bag of gift bags, and locked my door behind me. The stairs creaked as I walked down, just like always. At Ross and Willow, the smell of roast meat and spices hit me as soon as I opened the door. Families were already eating at smaller tables. There was the jingle of cutlery, the murmur of conversations, the clink of glasses. Evan, the bartender, waved at me from behind the counter. Evelyn came out from the kitchen, wiping her hands on an apron, and led me to the long table they had pushed together under the big front windows. It looked beautiful to me. White tablecloth, simple centerpieces with candles and pine branches, 16 chairs, polished and waiting. I took my time placing the gift bags, one at each plate, making sure the names were in the right order. Mark and Sophie at one end with their kids near them, Leah and Dylan at the other with theirs. I left my own seat in the middle, thinking that way I could hear conversations from both sides. When I finished, I stepped back and looked at the table, trying to see it the way a stranger would. It looked like a promise. 8 o'clock came, and I checked my phone. No messages. 8:15. I sent a quick line to the group chat asking if they were on their way. The little check mark appeared, but no one answered. Evelyn passed by and asked gently if they were delayed. I smiled and said that traffic was probably heavy, that they were always running late for things like this. She nodded and went back to the bar, telling staff to hold some of the dishes back for a bit. By 8:30, other tables had finished dessert. The waiter assigned to our long table kept bringing fresh water and adjusting cutlery that no one had used. A small family at a corner table kept glancing over at the empty seats, then away. I checked my phone again. Still nothing. I tried calling Mark. The call rang and rang, then went to voicemail. I tried Leah next. Same result. I sent another message asking if everything was all right. No answer. My chest started to feel tight, but I kept my face neutral. The staff had no reason to carry my panic onto their busy night. Around 9, Evelyn came to my table with a careful expression and asked if I wanted to start the buffet anyway, maybe eat something while I waited. I shook my head at first and said they would be there soon, then saw the pity in her eyes and heard my own words. I told her to go ahead and serve other people first, that I would let her know what to do with our order. She nodded, put a hand on my shoulder for a second, and left. 9:30. The roast at our section of the buffet had gone dry under the heat lamps. Staff were quietly swapping trays around so food would not be wasted. At some point, I accepted a small plate of food and ate it slowly, alone at the edge of the long table. Every time the door opened, my head turned. Every time, it was someone else's laughing family, bundled in scarves, shaking snow from their coats. By 10, it was clear they were not coming. No message, no call, nothing. Just silence. Evelyn came back with the bill folded in a leather holder and an apology in her eyes. She said they could knock off some of the costs since the full buffet had not been used. She said maybe my children had an emergency. I nodded and told her it was not her fault, that we had agreed on the price and that staff had done their work. I insisted on paying what we had settled, plus a tip for the people who had prepared the food. She hesitated, then took my card. While she was at the register, I finally opened my phone properly instead of just staring at the blank group chat. I switched over to social media, more out of habit than intention. The app loaded, and there it was, near the top of my feed. A photo of Mark and Leah, their spouses, the grandkids, and a few of their well-dressed friends, all crowded around a long table in another house. Glasses raised, faces turned toward the camera, smiles wide. Behind them, a perfect Christmas tree and a big modern fireplace. The caption read, "First Christmas in our new family tradition, surrounded by our people, grateful beyond words." Leah had added a line about closing old chapters, opening new ones. For a second, the room around me went very quiet. The noise from other tables faded into a distant hum. All I could see was that photo and the timestamp on it, posted right around the moment I had been telling Evelyn they were probably stuck in traffic. I looked closely and saw that the number of people around that table matched the number of chairs at mine. 16. I realized my children had not simply forgotten or been delayed. They had chosen another table, another story, and I had not even earned a text. My hand was still on the phone when a small red circle appeared at the top of the screen. A notification popped up. Someone had tagged me in a comment under that same photo. I watched the little banner slide down while my other hand rested on the cold metal of the bistro's glass door handle, and for the first time that night, something inside me shifted from hurt to something else entirely. I did not open the notification right away. I stood there with my hand on the door handle, the cold metal under my palm, and let the noise of the restaurant slowly come back into focus. Someone laughed at the bar. A chair scraped across the floor. A child at another table shouted that he wanted more ice cream. Life was carrying on all around me while I made sense of the fact that my children had built a new Christmas somewhere else and still felt comfortable using words like family and grateful in front of the whole world. I finally slid the phone back into my pocket, signed the receipt Evelyn brought, thanked her for the evening, and stepped out into the icy night. The streetlights smeared yellow across wet pavement. My breath came out in little clouds. I walked home slowly, not because my legs were tired, but because I was not ready to sit in my silent apartment just yet. By the time I climbed the stairs to my place, the numbness had turned into a kind of heavy ache that sat behind my ribs. I turned on the lamp in the living room, took off my coat, and saw the big bag of unopened gift bags still sitting by the door where I had put it down earlier. 16 small tokens of my hope, neatly labeled with names of people who had raised glasses somewhere else. I carried the bag to the dining table and finally opened the notification on my phone. Under the photo of the new family tradition, someone had commented that they hoped Grandpa had a wonderful holiday too. Leah had replied that some chapters close so new ones can start, and a mutual friend had tagged my name in that thread, like a gentle tap on the shoulder. It was strange reading about myself, as if I were some old story they were bravely letting go. I scrolled back through older posts on their pages. There were photos of them in matching pajamas, photos of them at ski resorts, photos of them smiling with their in-laws around long tables. Sometimes I appeared in a corner of a picture from years ago, usually carrying something heavy or standing near the kitchen. The captions were always about how proud they were of their partners, their promotions, their chosen family. In the more recent years, my face had simply disappeared. If you looked only at their feeds, it would seem like they had raised themselves, bought their houses with pure talent, and built their holidays from thin air. Sitting at my little table, I thought back over how this slow erasing had happened. It had not started with Christmas. It had started with 100 small decisions over years. I remembered when Mark got his first job at the logistics company. He had been nervous about the interview, twisting his tie, complaining that he did not have enough experience. I had spent 25 years at that point working my way up from loading trucks to supervising entire shifts. I spoke to the founder, told him my son was hardworking and would listen. The founder trusted my word and agreed to see him. Mark got the job, and at first he was grateful, telling everyone that his dad had pulled some strings. Over time, the story changed. At parties, he would tell people he had started at the bottom and earned everything on his own, like I had never stood behind him. At his first promotion party years later, I had brought a homemade cake to the warehouse break room. The icing was not perfect, but I wrote his name on it as neatly as I could. His coworkers clapped, and he smiled, but later, when talking to his friends, he said in a joking tone that I was old school and didn't understand corporate life. They laughed, and I felt myself shrinking a little in that fluorescent light, standing there with empty cake plates in my hands. He did not mean it as a knife, at least not at first. But the point still went in. Leah had always been the more artistic one. She loved photos, makeup, theater. When she married Dylan, the wedding took place at his parents' big estate on the edge of town. They had a sweeping driveway, a garden with lights in the trees, a hired photographer, and a catered dinner. When I quietly suggested that maybe some part of the celebration could be at the old family house where she had grown up, she took my hand and gently told me that she wanted something that reflected who they were now. She said the house where she grew up held too many heavy memories and not enough light. I did not ask which memories those were. I assumed she meant the years when I had worked nights and slept through weekends. At the reception, I started to stand up for a speech, heart pounding, words about her first day of school on the tip of my tongue. Before I could speak, Leah caught my eye from across the room and gave a tiny shake of her head. Later, she came over and said it would have been too emotional and might have brought down the mood. She said I could tell her those stories in private instead. The only time she mentioned me into the microphone was when she thanked both sets of parents for helping make the day possible. The checks I had written were invisible under the candles and flowers. There were other times, too. When Leah needed help covering the last bit of her student loans because her flexible job in creative consulting did not pay regularly, I dipped into my savings and told her it was a gift, not a loan. When Mark and Sophie were short on the down payment for their big suburban house, I cashed out a part of an old retirement account and wired them the money. They promised to pay me back when things settle, which somehow never quite happened. Birthdays, anniversaries, broken cars, surprise expenses. Whenever there was a crisis, my phone would ring. Whenever there was a celebration, my name usually stayed off the list of people they thanked in public. Even small comments added up. At Mark's housewarming party, I remember a moment when Sophie's friend asked who had helped them find the place. Sophie laughed and said that they had done it all themselves, that they had worked so hard to get into such a competitive neighborhood. She then turned to me, patted my arm, and said I did not need to worry about anything anymore, that they would take care of me when I was old. The irony did not seem to touch her. I was the one who had signed the bank forms so the mortgage would go through. In the last few years, invitations had come with small borders around them. Thanksgiving at Mark's house, but I was told to arrive an hour later so his in-laws could have family pictures first. Easter brunch at Leah's place, but she asked me not to bring any food because she did not want old-style dishes messing with her table aesthetic. I was allowed to sit, smile, and hold bowls while they took pictures around me. It was like I was part of the furniture, useful and quiet, but not meant to be the focus. I told myself for a long time that this was just how things were now. Times had changed. People lived their lives online. Parents were supposed to fade into the background and let their adult children stand in the spotlight. Every time something stung, I swallowed it and reminded myself that at least I was still invited. At least I could still see the grandkids open their presents. At least my name was still in their phones. You can convince yourself to accept a lot when you are afraid of losing the little you still have. But that Christmas buffet broke something that had already been cracked for years. It was not just the money. It was the fact that they had used my hope as part of their plan. They had allowed me to believe we were sharing a day right up until the last minute, then built a new tradition in a house I had helped pay for, and wrote captions about closing old chapters as if I were a bad book they had finally put back on the shelf. The next day, my neighbor, Mrs. Jenkins, knocked on my door with a plate of leftover cookies. She is in her 70s, sharp as a tack, and lives 3 doors down. She heard my television through the wall when big games were on, and knew the rhythm of my footsteps in the hallway. She asked how my Christmas had gone, and because I was too tired to pretend, I told her the truth in simple pieces. I said my children had planned to come to the restaurant and then gone somewhere else instead without telling me. I did not mention the photo at first, but she had already seen it online. Her granddaughter had shown it to her on a tablet. She tapped the screen with a wrinkled finger and pointed out my absence with a small frown. She said that I had given those kids everything, that she remembered seeing me leave for work before dawn when they were young, and that they should be ashamed. She said families sometimes forgot who built the floors they walked on. Her words were not dramatic, but they were solid and heavy. They landed in the same place as the photo had. I thanked her for the cookies and for listening. After she left, I sat back down at my table and finally pulled out an old folder from the drawer by my chair. It was stuffed with papers I had not looked at in a long time, old benefit statements, letters from the company founder, documents from the bank. As I spread the papers out, my phone vibrated again on the table. I glanced at the screen, expecting maybe a late apology from one of the kids, a quick message blaming scheduling or misunderstanding. Instead, I saw a small notification slide down from the top. My calendar app had chimed, reminding me of something I had set months ago and then ignored. The words on the screen were simple: year-end review, shares and beneficiaries. I stared at that line for a long moment, then looked at the stack of papers in front of me and felt, very quietly, that maybe this Christmas was not only the end of something, it might also be the beginning of a very different kind of conversation. The calendar reminder on my phone kept flashing at the top of the screen while I sorted the papers on my table. Year-end review, shares and beneficiaries. At first, I thought about swiping it away and pretending I had not seen it. It was something my old lawyer had suggested a year ago when I first retired. Back then, I had told her I was too busy helping the kids settle into their new homes and jobs. I laughed and said I would get to it later. Later had arrived without asking me. Now it sat there in small, calm letters, waiting to see what kind of man I wanted to be with the time I had left. I pulled out the chair and sat down. The folder in front of me was an old one, edges soft from years inside a drawer. I opened it slowly, like you open a box in the attic that might hold something you are not ready to remember. On top were benefit statements from the logistics company, showing decades of contributions and a modest pension. Under those, I found a thin stack of letters from the founder, Mr. Walker. One of them caught my eye because it was on heavier paper and had my name written by hand at the top. I remembered that envelope. He gave it to me the day I signed the papers to become more than just an employee. At the time, I had not thought of it as ownership. He had said I had been loyal for so long that he wanted me to have a stake in what I had helped build. I signed where he pointed, shook his hand, and went back to the warehouse floor. I was never a man who measured himself in percentages. But as I read the first part of the letter again, some pieces clicked into place. It talked in simple terms about me holding a share of the company, not just as a gift, but with certain rights. It mentioned that my approval was needed for some types of decisions. It spoke about voting power and the option to sell my share under specific conditions. The details were written in legal language, but the meaning was clear enough even for me. I had more say than I had ever used. I leaned back in my chair and let that sink in. While Mark bragged to friends about how he was basically running the place now, while my kids treated me like a retired extra in the background of their lives, I had been quietly holding a key piece of the thing they depended on. I had never waved it around, never used it to demand respect or favors. Maybe that had been a mistake. Maybe staying silent had taught them that my silence meant I had nothing. A few days after Christmas, Mark called and asked if I could stop by the office. His tone was brisk but friendly, the way people talk when they want something but do not want to look like they want it. He said they were planning new structures for the company as Mr. Walker slowed down, and he wanted to loop me in so that everyone is on the same page. I agreed to come. I did not mention the folder on my table, or the letter, or the memory of him laughing in that Christmas photo. I just said I would be there. Walking onto the logistics yard felt like stepping onto a stage I knew by heart. The smell of diesel and cold metal, the sound of trucks backing up, the echo of voices calling out instructions. For years, this had been my world. I knew which pallets squeaked, which drivers liked to talk, which doors froze in winter. Now younger men moved around in bright safety vests, some of them nodding when they saw me, some not knowing who I was at all. That was normal. Time changes the cast, even if the set stays the same. Inside the main building, I passed the bulletin board where my retirement photo still hung in the corner. "Thank you, Tom, for 40 years, the faded marker said under my smiling face. Next to it, there was a newer poster about the company's next generation of leaders, with Mark front and center, shaking hands with Mr. Walker in a staged shot. The caption under that photo said, "Building the Future." My name was nowhere near it. I studied both pictures for a moment, then kept walking. Mark's office used to be a small shared space when he started here. Now he had a glass-walled room looking over part of the warehouse. When I reached it, the door was half open. I heard his voice before I saw him. He was on speakerphone talking to someone who sounded like Dylan. He was laughing in that loose way people do when they feel safe and important. He said something about how the old man had finally retired at last, and how soon the real owners would take the wheel. Dylan's voice came through the speaker, asking if that meant Mark was going to inherit the whole thing. Mark joked that it would technically be shared, but that he would have the bigger say. I did not move, I stayed just out of view and listened as he went on. He said that his father never cared about business, and that he had never bothered to understand what the company could really be. He said he was grateful for what I had done as a worker, but that it was time for the modern generation to step in. They laughed about old guys who did not know when to get out of the way. At one point, he even said that he would soon talk to the board about buying out whatever tiny share Dad got out of pity. The words hit harder than I expected, not because they were new, but because they were so open. I had always suspected that Mark saw me as small. Now I heard him sell that image of me, like a story he had practiced. The part about my share stung in a different way. He spoke about something he did not understand, as if it were already in his pocket. It reminded me of those Christmas captions. He liked to claim things as done before they were even begun. When he finally noticed me at the door, his voice changed. He told whoever was on the other end that he would call back, then hit the button to end the call. He stood up, smiled, and said it was good to see me. He asked how my Christmas had been in a tone that told me he already knew. He said there had been a mix-up, and that they had ended up at another gathering, and that things had moved fast. He avoided using the words, "we did not come." I nodded and said only that the food at the bistro had been good. He did not ask how it felt to sit at a table set for 16 alone. Then he shifted to business. He said Mr. Walker was talking about stepping back soon, and that there were exciting opportunities on the horizon. He said the company was considering a reorganization and that they might move some shares around for tax reasons. He hinted very softly that my stake could be put to better use in younger hands. He told me I did not need to worry about paperwork at my age, that he could handle all that. He kept his tone light, as if he were offering to help me carry groceries. I asked him, in the same calm voice I had used all my life, if he knew exactly what shares I held and what rights came with them. He froze for just a second, then said that he assumed I had a small piece from years ago, nothing major. He said the lawyers would explain it all, and that I did not need to get lost in the details. I watched his eyes as he spoke, and saw something I had not seen often in him, a flicker of uncertainty. It told me he knew less than he pretended. I did not argue. I told him I would think about everything he had said, and that I appreciated being included. We shook hands, and he patted my arm like he always did, in that half-patronizing way he had picked up in management courses. As I walked out, I passed Marta, one of the dispatchers I had worked with for years. She gave me a quick hug and asked if the kids had treated me right this year. I told her quietly what had happened at the bistro. Her face tightened, and she said that some people only understand cost when a bill arrives with their name on it. Then she asked if I was still that guy Mr. Walker had trusted with real decisions. I said I was, and she smiled in a way that looked a lot like respect. Later that week, Leah called and invited me to drop by her loft to see the kids' new toys and catch up after the holidays. I went partly to see my grandkids, partly to see if anyone there felt even a little guilty. The loft was bright and full of expensive little things that looked fragile. The kids ran around with new gadgets, happy and loud. Leah greeted me with a quick hug and a flood of words about how busy they had been. She said Christmas had turned into a whole thing at a friend's house and that she had meant to text but got caught up. She never used the word sorry. Dylan made jokes about how many dinners they had to attend in one day and said they were trying to balance old obligations with new traditions. He laughed about being in high demand, placing himself in the center of every story. At one point, Leah put her arm through his and told me they were thinking about buying their own place soon, something bigger than the loft, and might need my advice on dealing with banks because I had done it before, with Mark. She said it in a sweet voice, like she was offering me a role in their success. I smiled and said I would think about what advice I had left to give. On the way home that evening, I realized that was the line for me. It was not just the empty table or the photo or the silence. It was the ease with which they turned my pain into a footnote and then reached out for the next favor. They saw me as a resource, not a person, as a backup plan for their image and their comfort. I had spent years giving, telling myself that love meant staying available. I decided, in that slow walk back to my apartment, that love could also mean stepping away when your presence only teaches people that disrespect is safe. Back at my small table, I opened the folder from Mr. Walker again. This time I did not just read the first lines. I went through everything carefully, using a pen to underline dates and numbers. I did not fully grasp every legal phrase, but I understood enough. Voting rights, sale options, control over certain decisions, the weight of my signature. I understood that I had something my children did not expect me to use. I picked up my phone and opened my contacts. My finger hovered over Rachel's name, the lawyer who had been patiently reminding me for months that later was not a plan. For a moment, old habits tried to stop me. They whispered that I would hurt my kids, that I should wait, that maybe they would change on their own. Then I thought of the 16 chairs, the empty plates, the caption about closing old chapters, the conversation in Mark's office, Leah's soft request for advice, as if nothing had happened. I pressed the call button. The line rang twice, then a calm, recorded voice from her office answered, asking me to leave a message or stay on the line for the next assistant. I stayed. When a real person picked up and asked how they could help, I said in a steady voice that I was ready to schedule that year-end review, and that this time I would not cancel. Rachel's assistant put me on the calendar for early January. She spoke in a polite, efficient voice and asked if I could bring any documents I had about my shares, my will, and any property or accounts in my name. I told her I had an old folder that probably held most of it. After the call ended, I sat there looking at the stack of papers spread across my table. For years, I had treated them like complicated reminders of things other people understood better. Now I saw them as tools I had never picked up. I started making a new pile, separating letters from statements, company papers from bank forms. It felt like sweeping a floor I had walked on for decades without seeing the dust. On the morning of the meeting, I took extra time with my clothes. I chose my neatest shirt, the one with the least frayed collar, and pressed it as best I could with my old iron. The sky was a hard gray, the kind that makes the whole city look like it is holding its breath. I took the bus downtown, holding the folder tight on my lap so it would not bend. Rachel's office was on the 8th floor of a glass building that smelled vaguely of coffee and printer ink. The waiting room had soft chairs, a quiet radio, and a bowl of candy on the table. When she came out to greet me, she did not speak to me like a confused old man. She shook my hand firmly, looked me in the eye, and said she was glad I came. In her office, she cleared a space on the conference table and asked if we could go through what I had in simple steps. I liked that she used those words. I told her I needed simple. I laid out the share documents and Mr. Walker's letter first. She read them carefully, moving her finger along certain lines, making notes on a legal pad. She asked a few clear questions about when I had signed, what I had been told at the time, and whether I had ever voted or sold any part of my share. I explained that I had always trusted Mr. Walker and never thought much about power, only about keeping the work going. She told me, in plain language, that my stake in the company was not tiny. She said it came with real voting rights and a say in some big decisions. She said very gently that people in my position often underestimated their own leverage and that others sometimes counted on that. Then she asked about my will and my current list of beneficiaries. I admitted I had left most things to Mark and Leah years ago, when they were still building their lives, and had not changed anything since my retirement. She asked if those documents still matched my reality and my values. For the first time, I answered no, without trying to soften it. We spoke about options. She told me there was nothing illegal or cruel about choosing to direct my money where it would be respected and used well. She reminded me that my children had already built lives with a lot of help. She asked if there were people or causes that made me feel seen. I told her about the community center where I had been volunteering for holiday food drives and after-school programs. I told her about Marta and the warehouse staff, about workers who had broken bodies from years of lifting boxes, just like me. As I spoke, I heard how much of myself lived outside the walls of my children's houses. Rachel suggested that we could update my will to reflect that. Maybe part of my estate could go to a fund for staff emergencies, part to the community center, part to the grandchildren directly when they were adults, instead of through their parents. She said Mark and Leah did not need to be cut off completely unless I wanted that, but that the automatic assumption that they would inherit everything was not a law of nature. It was just a habit that could be changed. I listened and felt something open inside my chest. Not anger, not revenge, just the realization that I had choices. We did not finalize anything that first day. She asked me to think about what would make me sleep better at night, not what would make me feel powerful for 10 minutes. She gave me a simple checklist to complete: list major accounts, list past financial help to the kids, list people and places that had supported me when I had nothing to give back. She said we would meet again with a clearer picture. Before I left, she also mentioned the company's situation. She had heard through her own channels that there might be a buyer interested in investing in stable logistics companies rather than flipping them. If I wished, she said, we could explore selling my stake in a way that protected long-time employees. She told me nothing needed to be rushed, but that I was not as small in this story as I had been told. Leaving her office, I walked a few blocks to my bank. The building was more modest than the glass tower I had just left, but it held a different kind of weight for me. Inside, the teller led me to a small private office where a financial advisor sat behind a desk with a computer and stacks of folders. He pulled up my accounts and showed me numbers on the screen. Savings here, a small investment account there. Enough to live on, not enough to impress anyone who measures worth in luxury cars and vacations. Still, it was the result of a life of steady work. I asked about setting up a separate fund that could later be directed to the community center and staff causes. He explained some options in simple words, wrote them down for me, and printed a few pages. I signed some forms authorizing changes, but I did not read every line of legal text. I read the parts that mattered to me, where the money would go, under what conditions, and who would be notified. Over the next week, I worked on the checklist Rachel had given me. In the evenings, I sat at my table with a notebook and wrote down numbers. I tried to remember every time I had helped Mark and Leah in a big way: the down payment on Mark's house, the tuition help for Leah, the car loan I had co-signed, the smaller amounts for broken appliances, surprise trips, vacations, holidays, unpaid bills. I did not do it to build a case against them. I did it to show myself the pattern I had been living inside. When I totaled the amounts, I had to sit back and take a breath. The number was larger than the cost of that Christmas buffet by a mountain. One afternoon, I went to the community center. It sits in an old brick building near the bus lines with a faded sign and a playground out back. Inside, it smells like floor cleaner, crayons, and coffee. I volunteer there sometimes, helping pack boxes, fixing loose shelves, moving chairs for events. The director, a woman named Carla, waved me over as I entered. She thanked me again for the extra hours I had put in before the holidays and mentioned, in front of some staff and kids, that I was one of their most dependable volunteers. She said something about how the place would not run without people like me. As I helped set up tables for a small New Year's event, I watched the kids who came there. Some had parents who worked late. Some were being raised by grandparents. Some just needed a safe place to be after school. When snacks were ready, they sat at the plastic tables and laughed with their mouths full, not caring about how anything looked online. I felt more present in that noisy room than I had felt at my own children's polished gatherings in years. It made me think again about what family could mean. A few days later, I met with Rachel again. This time, our conversation was more focused. I showed her my notebook with the list of support given to Mark and Leah. I told her I was not trying to punish them, but that I could not keep rewarding the kind of behavior they had shown. I said I wanted my remaining money and influence to protect people who actually showed up when food was on the table. She listened, then laid out a plan in simple steps. We would adjust my will so that Mark and Leah still received something, but no longer the lion's share. We would create conditions that required them to show basic respect and contact if they wished to receive full amounts. We would direct a significant portion to the community center and a fund for current and former company workers. She also told me that interest from the potential company buyer was real, not rumor. They valued stable operations and trusted staff ecosystems. They had asked questions about who held certain shares. She explained that I could agree to sell my stake under terms that protected staff and gave me a chance to move on from being tied to the company's future choices. We did not sign final sale papers yet, but we set the path. I felt like I had been standing in a hallway for years, and someone had finally opened a door at the far end. All this time, Mark and Leah continued as usual. Their social media showed brunches, weekend trips, and shots of the kids in matching hats. No one called to ask how I had felt on Christmas. No one dropped by with leftovers or even a simple plate. At most, I received a short text from Leah saying she hoped I had found peace with how the year had ended. Mark sent a link to a poll about new company policies and asked me to support the progressive option because it would look good for him when the board reviewed it. He did not ask if I understood the details, only if I would click approve. The shift came in late January in the form of a bright, cheerful group message in our family chat. Mark wrote that he and Sophie wanted to host a New Year, New Traditions dinner at Ross and Willow to celebrate his exciting upcoming leadership role at the company. He said it would be a chance for family and key stakeholders to toast the future. Leah replied with excited emojis. Sophie added that it would be nice to show Evelyn they were still supporting local businesses. No one mentioned the last time we had all almost gathered there. I stared at the message for a while. The phrase key stakeholders echoed in my mind in a new way, now that I had sat with Rachel and read my documents. I typed a simple reply saying I would attend and that I could help with arrangements. Mark responded quickly, saying that would be amazing and that I always handled logistics well. I could almost hear the small laugh in his voice. Then I opened a separate message thread and wrote to Evelyn. I asked if Ross and Willow had a private room available for the date Mark had suggested, one that could fit 16 people comfortably. She replied that they did, the same space they used for small parties and meetings. She asked if this was another family holiday. I told her it was something like that, and that this time I wanted a bit more privacy and a clear bill in my own name. She said she could arrange that and asked gently if I was sure about hosting again. I answered that I was not hosting in the same way as before, but that I needed the table. When I put the phone down, I looked around my small apartment. It did not feel any bigger. My bank account had not suddenly doubled. My back still ached by the end of every day, but something had shifted. I was no longer waiting to be invited into my own life. I was setting the table in every sense, and this time I knew exactly who I was and what I was bringing. The days leading up to the dinner at Ross and Willow passed in a slow, careful rhythm. I went about my routines as usual. I shopped for groceries, climbed the same tired stairs to my apartment, watched the same reruns on the small TV. On the outside, nothing looked different. Inside, though, I felt like a man who had finally found a map after walking in circles for years. I was still hurt, still disappointed, but I was no longer drifting. I knew where I wanted to stand, and I knew what I would and would not accept. A week before the dinner, I met with Rachel again. We sat at the same table in her office, the same stack of papers between us, but the energy felt different now. We were not exploring vague ideas anymore. We were putting pieces into place. She went over the steps we had discussed. Some things would change quietly on paper, some would remain the same. The important part was that every line would now match my real intentions instead of old habits. She asked again if I was sure about the adjustments concerning Mark and Leah. I told her I was. I said I did not want to ruin their lives, but I would no longer let them treat mine like a spare part in their story. She nodded and wrote a few more notes. There were documents to approve, but we kept the talk focused on the meaning, not the legal language. She also mentioned that the interested buyer had moved forward. They wanted a face-to-face conversation with a longtime shareholder who had helped build the company before final terms were settled. She asked carefully if I would be open to them being present, in some form, when I spoke with my family. Not to intimidate, she said, but to show that my choices were serious, bound to real people and real commitments. I thought about it for a while. I pictured Mark talking about real owners and old guys stepping aside, and I pictured the men and women on the warehouse floor who never got invited into those meetings. Then I said that if the buyer's representative respected what we were doing, they were welcome to see the full picture. Back at home, I made a few more lists. One for the dinner itself, number of seats, names, simple menu. Another for the people I now considered my real circle. On that second list, the names were different. Carla from the community center, Marta from the warehouse, Evelyn from Ross and Willow. A few neighbors like Mrs. Jenkins. They were not invited to this particular dinner, but they were in my mind when I thought about who my life actually touched. For the first time, my planning did not revolve around what my children might post about later. It revolved around who would still look me in the eye when the lights dimmed. A few days before the event, I stopped by the restaurant. The snow outside had turned into gray slush, and people hurried past, bundled in coats, faces down. Inside, Ross and Willow was warm and smelled of stew and bread. Evelyn met me near the bar with a clean apron and kind eyes. She led me to the private room, a space off to the side with sliding doors and a long table. The room had simple decor, a couple of framed black and white photos of the town, a string of lights around the window, a small artificial tree in the corner. It felt honest, not staged. We went over the details. 16 chairs again, but this time arranged a little differently. She asked if I wanted place cards. I told her I did, and that I would bring them myself. She asked about the menu, and I chose hearty, familiar dishes. I did not want anything fancy that would distract from the conversation. Then she asked, in a more careful tone, if I was sure I wanted to do this here again, after what had happened at Christmas. I told her, quietly, that this time was not about hoping they would show up. It was about showing myself that I could stand in the same place without begging for a seat at their table. She nodded slowly. Before I left, I asked her if she could hold an envelope for me in the office and bring it in only when I signaled. She agreed without asking what was inside. The night before the dinner, I laid out place cards on my table at home. I wrote each name by hand. Mark, Sophie, Leah, Dylan, and the grandchildren. I added my own name at the head of the table, not in the middle this time. I did not do it to feel important. I did it because someone needed to be the anchor, and I was done pretending I did not deserve to sit at the top of my own story. As I wrote, I thought about each person, about the moments that had led us here. There was love in those memories, but also clear lines I could now see. Times I had let disrespect slide, times I had laughed away my own pain so they would not feel uncomfortable. I realized I had taught them how far they could push me. Early on the day of the dinner, I stopped by the community center. Carla was in her office, surrounded by paper and a broken chair she was trying to fix with duct tape. She smiled when she saw me and asked if I had time to help move some boxes. We worked side by side in the storage room, shifting heavy crates of canned food and sorting donated clothes. At one point, she asked very casually how my holidays had gone. I gave her the shorter version of the story. The Christmas buffet, the empty seats, the photo of my children at someone else's table. Her jaw tightened, but she did not speak badly about them. Instead, she asked how I was holding up. I said I was tired of being surprised by the same lesson, that people will treat your generosity like a faucet if you never install a handle. She chuckled softly at that and said she was glad I was finally thinking about who deserved what from me. Before I left, I told her that some changes were coming and that the center might be part of my plans. She looked at me with cautious hope and said that whatever I decided, she was grateful I showed up when I said I would. There was no long speech, no dramatic hug, just a hand on my arm and quiet respect. That meant more to me than any toast under a designer chandelier. In the afternoon, I stopped by the warehouse. It was not my place anymore, not on paper, but the security guard still waved me through with a familiar nod. Inside, the noise of forklifts and shouted orders echoed off the high ceilings. I found Marta near the dispatch office, juggling clipboards and phone calls. When she saw me, she grinned and told the person on the line to hold. She asked how I was and, without me prompting, said she still could not believe what my kids had done at Christmas. I told her I believed it now, and that sometimes belief was the first step out of a bad pattern. I did not share all the details of my arrangements with her, but I did mention that I was working on something that might help the staff in the long run. She looked at me with that sharp, searching gaze she had and asked if this had anything to do with the rumors about a buyer. I only said that any change I agreed to would not come at the workers' expense if I could help it. She squeezed my shoulder and said that whatever happened, they would remember who had actually stood on the floor with them, not who posed for pictures on the website. Later that evening, back at home, I stood in front of the small mirror near my door. I tied my tie slowly, fingers stiff, and thought about all the times I had dressed up for other people's big moments. Birthdays, weddings, graduations, promotions. I had stood in crowds, clapped at the right times, smiled on command. This time, the moment belonged to me. Not in a loud, triumphant way, but in a quiet, deliberate one. I picked up the folder with a few papers Rachel had asked me to keep handy and slipped it into my bag. Then I took the place cards, stacked them carefully, and put them in a small envelope. Before leaving, I paused by the bag of old Christmas gift bags still sitting near the corner. I had not thrown them away yet. Part of me had been waiting for a reason. I opened the bag and pulled out a few. The names written on them made my chest tighten again, but the feeling was different now. Less raw, more settled. I took one bag without any name and slipped a small note into it. Just a few lines in my own handwriting. Not a threat, not a plea. Just a clear statement of where I stood now and what I would no longer do. I folded the top closed and set that one bag aside from the rest. At Ross and Willow, the winter air bit at my cheeks as I walked from the bus stop. Inside, the warmth and light washed over me. Evelyn greeted me near the bar. She had set aside a small tray of appetizers, knowing I would likely arrive early. We walked together to the private room. The table was already set, simple and neat. White plates, folded napkins, clear glasses catching the light. I laid out the place cards one by one, the letters facing the chairs where each person would sit. My name at the head, Mark and Sophie to my right, Leah and Dylan to my left. The grandkids clustered nearby. It looked almost festive, but this was not a party in the way they understood that word. Evelyn asked quietly if there was anything else I needed. I handed her the envelope we had spoken about before. I told her there might be a moment when I would look toward the bar and raise my hand slightly. When that happened, I said, I would need her to bring this envelope into the room and set it on the table in front of me. She did not ask what was inside or why. She just nodded once and slipped it into her apron pocket before stepping back out into the main dining area. I checked my phone. A message from Mark said they were on their way and asked if everything was set up. Another from Leah said she was excited to reset the tone for the year. Neither message mentioned the past. Neither contained any hint of apology. For the first time, reading their words did not twist my stomach. They were just information now, data points in a pattern I finally understood. I replied that the room was ready and that I would see them soon. I walked out to the bar and sat on a stool facing the dining room. From there, I could see the main entrance. Families came and went. Couples took photos by the tree. The sound of cutlery and conversation carried through the air. I sipped a glass of water, not wanting anything to blur my focus. My phone buzzed once more. This time it was a brief message from Rachel. Just a simple line saying she was available by phone if anything changed or if I needed support afterward. I read it twice and put the phone back in my pocket. A few minutes later, the front door opened and cold air swirled in. I saw Mark first, tall and confident in a dark coat, Sophie beside him in a perfect winter outfit. Behind them came Leah and Dylan, laughing at something on his phone. The grandkids hurried in, rosy-cheeked, chattering about dessert. They all looked like a scene from the photos they loved so much. Evelyn greeted them with a smile and guided them toward the private room. From my seat at the bar, they did not see me right away. I watched them disappear through the sliding doors, carrying their noise and energy with them. I stood up, straightened my shirt, and walked slowly toward the closed doors. Through the thin wall, I could already hear chairs scraping and voices choosing seats, familiar patterns of people assuming everything around them was arranged for their comfort. My steps were steady. At the doorway, I paused for a brief moment, feeling the weight of the folder in my bag and the lightness in my chest. On the other side of that door, my children were waiting for a version of me that no longer existed. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. Everyone was already seated, coats on chairbacks, napkins in laps. Mark was standing with his glass raised, mid-sentence, saying they wanted to reset after a weird Christmas. When he saw me, he smiled wider and said they were just talking about how grateful they were for me. I walked to the head of the table and sat down without touching my glass. The room cooled a little. Leah watched my face like she was reading a screen. Sophie kept her host smile on. Dylan slipped his phone into his pocket. The kids bounced in their seats, asking about dessert. I let the silence stretch, then thanked them for coming and said I was glad we were finally in the same room. Mark launched into his speech again. He talked about the company, about big changes, and his upcoming leadership role. He said this dinner was to celebrate our family's future and my legacy. He added that some old paperwork needed to be cleaned up so everything could flow smoothly to the next generation. Leah nodded and said we needed to leave heavy feelings in the past. I listened, hands folded. When they finished, I asked one simple question. I asked where they had been, exactly, on Christmas night while I sat alone at a table for 16 in the same restaurant. The question hit harder than any speech. Mark's smile slipped. Leah's eyes went to Dylan. Sophie stared at her plate. They started offering reasons, a last-minute invite, a party that snowballed, assumptions that I would understand because I was easygoing. Leah said she had meant to call but got caught up with the kids. No one used the word wrong. No one said, I am sorry. They tried to sand down the edge with soft phrases. I let them talk, then nodded. I said I understood now, but not how they thought. I told them Christmas had shown me my real place in their lives. Not as a father, but as a convenient backup. A bank card, a name they could leave out when a nicer picture appeared. so that truth had sent me back to some old papers. I glanced toward the bar. Evelyn, who had been watching like someone who has seen many families break and mend at these tables, caught my eye. She came in, placed a thick envelope in front of me without a word, and stepped out, sliding the door almost shut. The murmur of the restaurant outside became a low hum behind us. I rested my hand on the envelope and said that for years I had trusted my quiet work to speak for itself. I never asked for public praise. I helped with down payments, tuition, emergencies, always glad to do it. Then I said something had changed. I no longer believed respect was optional. It was the price of being included. I opened the envelope and took out smaller ones. One for Mark and Sophie, one for Leah and Dylan, others with names they did not recognize. I handed them theirs and asked them not to open them at the table. I told them those letters explained, in clear language, the changes I had made. I said my shares in the company were no longer an invisible future gift to them, but part of a sale being negotiated with conditions to protect longtime workers and to support a community fund in my name. Mark's voice lost its polish when he asked what I meant. I explained that my stake was larger than he had assumed, and that I had finally exercised the rights that came with it. Any buyer would now be bound to a workers' protection and support clause. When the sale closed, my tie to company decisions would end, and so would any expectation that I would quietly clear a path for his career. From now on, he would stand on his own record. Leah gripped her envelope and asked if this was punishment. I told her no one was taking back what had already been given, but I said the idea that she and her brother would automatically inherit almost everything was gone. My will now directed a large part of what I had to the community center and to a fund for staff who got hurt or aged out after years on the floor. The grandchildren would each have a modest trust, only accessible when they were adults. She and Mark would still inherit something, but no longer more than everyone who had actually shown up when I needed them. Dylan muttered that this felt dramatic, that families should handle things in private. I reminded him that they had chosen to make their new traditions public, while leaving me alone at a table that staff still remember. I told him I was not raising my voice or breaking dishes. I was just aligning my actions with the way they had already chosen to treat me. The children looked confused. I turned to them and said gently that none of this was their fault. I told them that one day those letters would explain how their grandfather had wanted to give them something steady that did not depend on anyone else's mood or social media post. I said I hoped they would grow up deciding for themselves what respect meant. No one toasted after that. The food arrived, but forks hovered and put almost nothing into mouths. Mark asked to speak to me outside the room, and I told him there was nothing I would say in private that I was afraid to say in front of his family. Leah's eyes filled, more with shock than regret. Sophie kept tracing patterns on the tablecloth. Dylan checked his phone as if he could scroll out of the moment. I finished my water, thanked them all for coming, and wished them well with the new traditions they were building. I told them the staff would bring the bill to me, and that they were free to stay, eat, or leave, but that I was done chasing empty chairs. Then I pushed my chair back and stood. As I walked through the bar toward the exit, I saw the room reflected faintly in the front window, a full table, 16 chairs, my children sitting with unopened envelopes in their hands, surrounded by food they had insisted on having, unable to take a bite. Outside, the winter air hit my face, cold and clean. I closed my coat, nodded a quiet thanks to Evelyn at the bar, and stepped out, leaving the sliding door behind me half open with the bill and the truth finally sitting in front of the right people.